The clock on the office wall read 11:40 when Elena Marsh heard the front door of the law firm click open, even though she was certain she had locked it 2 hours earlier. She froze, with a pen in her hand, papers spread across the desk in uneven stacks. The building was supposed to be empty. Dana Whitfield, the only other person who ever worked this late, had gone home with a fever hours ago, leaving Elena alone with a folder of estate documents that needed to be filed before morning. She told herself it was the wind. Old buildings made old sounds. She went back to the papers, because the papers did not care about her nerves, and the deadline did not care either. Elena had been a paralegal at Whitfield & Combs for 3 years, and in those 3 years, she had never once been trusted with something this important. The firm handled the private affairs of families whose names appeared in newspapers for reasons other than crime. Families with land that had been passed down since before anyone could remember why it mattered. Normally, Elena filed the small things: divorce papers, property disputes, the occasional will for someone whose relatives were already fighting over furniture. Tonight was different. Mr. Whitfield himself had called her at 9 in the evening, his voice tight with the kind of stress that came from very important clients. There had been an emergency filing needed for the Voss estate, one of the oldest and most private families the firm represented, and every senior associate was either out of town or unreachable. He needed someone to review the final folder, confirm the signatures were in the right places, and get it to the courier by midnight so it could be delivered to the family lawyer first thing in the morning. He had trusted her with it because there was no one else, and Elena had said yes, because saying yes was the only way she had ever gotten anywhere. She rubbed her eyes and looked at the clock again. 11:42. Her mother was sleeping 2 miles away in an apartment that smelled like the eucalyptus rub the home nurse used every evening, and somewhere in a drawer in that apartment was a stack of medical bills Elena had stopped opening because opening them did not change the number written at the bottom. She thought about her mother's laugh, thin now, but still there. She thought about the number. Then she thought about the pen in her hand and made herself focus. The folder in front of her held maybe 30 pages, most of them financial disclosures and property transfer forms, all written in the dense formal language that made her eyes ache after midnight. She had already reviewed the first 20 pages twice. It was mechanical work, checking initials against a signature card, confirming dates lined up, making sure nothing was left blank. There was a second folder on the desk, thinner, marked only with a case number and no family name. Mr. Whitfield had left it there earlier that day for an entirely different matter, something about a trust reactivation for another client. It had nothing to do with the Voss papers. It should never have been anywhere near them. Elena did not know that yet. She remembered, distantly, that Dana had mentioned a courier arriving early that morning and leaving a folder on the wrong desk before anyone had a chance to sort the day's deliveries properly. Elena had barely registered the comment at the time. It was the kind of small administrative mix-up that happened at least once a week in an office that handled this much paper, and by evening she had forgotten it entirely, the way a person forgets a single loose thread in a coat they never expect to unravel. She checked the clock again. 11:45. The courier was due at midnight, and midnight in that part of the city meant an empty street, a single working street lamp, and a driver who did not like to wait. She told herself to move faster. She told herself the strange wording on that final page was simply old-fashioned legal language, the kind lawyers loved for reasons she had never fully understood, phrases inherited from a version of the law that predated computers, predated telephones, predated most of the buildings she passed on her walk to work every morning. She told herself a great many things in those final minutes, and none of them turned out to matter at all. She reached the final page of what she believed was the Voss folder. It was a short document, only 2 paragraphs, written in old, formal wording that read more like a ceremony than a contract. She remembered thinking, distantly, that the wording was strange for a property filing, full of phrases like binding union and by mutual signature and in accordance with ancestral right. She was tired. She was thinking about her mother. She was thinking about the 2 miles between here and that apartment and whether the nurse had remembered the evening medication. She signed where the yellow tab told her to sign. She initialed where the smaller yellow tabs told her to initial. She stapled the folder closed, placed it in the courier envelope, sealed it, and did not look at it again. At 11:56, she locked the office door behind her and walked out into a night that felt colder than it had any right to be in early autumn. She told herself the shiver was the weather. She did not sleep well that night, though she could not have explained why. She lay in bed listening to the building settle, the pipes ticking, a car passing on the street below, and each time she closed her eyes, she saw the strange formal wording of that final page, the words binding union, floating behind her eyelids like something she had forgotten to ask about. She told herself it did not matter. She had initialed where she was told. That was the job. The next morning, Mr. Whitfield thanked her twice, told her the Voss family lawyer had confirmed receipt, and gave her the rest of the week off as a small reward. Elena went home, checked on her mother, paid the electric bill with money she did not quite have, and did not think about the folder again. 6 days passed in the ordinary way. 6 days pass when nothing seems to be wrong. She went to the pharmacy. She argued with an insurance representative for 40 minutes over a claim that should have been simple. She watched her mother eat half a bowl of soup and call it a good day. On the 7th day, she noticed the car. It was black, long, the kind of car that did not belong on her street, parked outside her apartment building, in a spot where no one ever parked because the curb was too narrow and the streetlight above it had been broken for a year. It was there when she left for work in the morning. It was there when she came home for lunch. She told herself it belonged to a neighbor's visitor, someone attending a funeral, someone she simply had not met. It was there again the next morning, and the one after that. Elena mentioned it to Dana over the phone on the second morning, half joking, calling it her mystery car, the kind of thing that would make a good story once it turned out to be nothing. Dana laughed and said the city was full of strange parking habits and stranger neighbors, and told her not to think about it too much. Elena tried to take the advice. She found over the following 2 days that she could not quite manage it. She started leaving for work 10 minutes earlier than usual, just to have an excuse to walk past the car slowly, to look at it directly, instead of catching glimpses from the corner of her eye the way she had the first day. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The paint was flawless, without a single scratch or speck of road dust, as though it had been driven directly out of a showroom and parked there without ever touching an ordinary street. She started noticing details she should not have needed to notice. The car never had its engine running. There was never condensation on the windows in the cold. No one ever got in or out of it that she could see, and yet the space it occupied never became empty, as if it did not need the ordinary permission a car needs to exist somewhere. On the 4th day of the car, a man in a dark gray coat knocked on her apartment door at 7 in the evening while she was helping her mother with her medication. He did not introduce himself right away. He held out an envelope, thick, cream-colored, sealed with a wax stamp she had only ever seen in old photographs of important documents. He asked, very politely, if she was Elena Marsh, and when she said yes, something shifted in his face that she could not name at the time but would remember clearly later. It was relief, not for her, for himself, for finally finding the right door. He said a car would come for her the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp, and that a representative of the Voss estate needed to speak with her regarding a matter of significant legal urgency. Elena laughed, because it was the kind of sentence that did not belong in her hallway, next to her mother's oxygen tank and the stack of unopened mail on the side table. She asked what matter. He said he was not authorized to explain further, only to deliver the message and confirm her attendance. She told him she had not signed anything for the Voss family. She had only reviewed documents in her role as a paralegal. She had done nothing that required her personal attendance anywhere. He looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient who has not yet been told the results of a test. He said, quietly, that according to the documents his office held, she had in fact signed something with her own name on it, her own signature, dated and witnessed and entirely legal. He left before she could ask him what. That night, Elena sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop open, searching every version of the words she remembered from the final page of that folder. Binding union, ancestral right, mutual signature. Nothing useful came up. She told herself it was probably a mistake, a clerical error, something that would be resolved in an hour once she showed up, and explained she had only initialed where the yellow tabs told her to initial. She told herself that until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of a car outside that she now knew for certain would still be there. At 9 o'clock the next morning, it was. She had expected the man in the gray coat. Instead, the back door of the long black car opened on its own, and a woman's gloved hand gestured for her to get in. The interior smelled like leather and something older, like a house that had been closed up for a long winter and only recently opened. Elena sat with her bag in her lap and her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and the car pulled away from her apartment building and did not head toward the small firm where she worked. It headed out of the city entirely, toward a part of the countryside she had only ever seen in photographs of places she would never be able to afford to visit, and the entire time, no one in the car said a single word to her, as though the silence itself was part of whatever was waiting for her at the end of the road. She did not know yet what she had signed. She only knew, watching the buildings thin out and the fields begin, that whatever it was, it had already decided something about her life before she had been given the chance to say no. The house came into view after almost 2 hours of driving, and Elena's first thought was that no single family should own something that large. It rose out of the countryside like a small gray mountain, all sharp roofs and long windows, with gardens on either side that had clearly been trimmed by someone who took the work seriously. The car passed through an iron gate that opened on its own, rolled along a gravel drive lined with old trees, and stopped in front of a set of stone steps wide enough to fit a wedding. A man was already waiting there when the door opened for her. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that fit him the way clothes only fit people who never had to think about money, and he did not smile when he introduced himself as Colton Briggs, senior counsel for the Voss family estate. He did not offer his hand. He simply said her name, confirmed it, and asked her to follow him inside. Elena followed, because there did not seem to be another option, and because some small stubborn part of her wanted to see this through, so she could go home and tell Dana about the strangest week of her life. She was led through a hallway with ceilings so high her voice would have echoed if she had spoken, past paintings of people who all seemed to share the same sharp jawline, and into a study lined with books that looked as though they had never been moved from their shelves. Mr. Briggs gestured for her to sit. She did not. He opened a leather folder on the desk between them, the same kind of folder she had seen 100 times in her own office, except this one held only a single document, already familiar in a way that made her stomach drop before she even read the words. It was the final page from the folder she had signed 6 nights ago. Mr. Briggs explained, in the flat, practiced tone of a man delivering bad news for a living, that the Voss family held a legal instrument dating back several generations, a clause written into the original estate charter that had never been formally removed from law, though it had not been invoked in over 80 years. The clause stated that should the current holder of the title fail to marry by a specified age, the estate's operating trust would pass, not to the title holder, but to a secondary branch of the family, effectively stripping him of control over land, income, and the house itself. There was, however, an older provision within the same clause, one so rarely used that most modern lawyers did not even know to look for it. It allowed for what the original document called a binding union by contractual signature, a legal marriage created not through ceremony but through the mutual signing of a specific document, valid the moment both signatures existed on the same page, witnessed and dated. Elena listened to all of this the way a person listens to a language they do not speak, waiting for the part that would make sense. Mr. Briggs turned the folder toward her and pointed at 2 signatures at the bottom of the page. One belonged to Alessandro Voss. The other belonged to her. She said, very slowly, that she had never signed anything with that name on it. She said she had reviewed property documents for a filing that had nothing to do with marriage, nothing to do with any Voss, that she had simply initialed where the yellow tabs told her to initial because that was her job and she had done her job correctly. Mr. Briggs said, without any apparent enjoyment, that a second folder had apparently been placed on her desk that night, mistakenly, by a junior clerk who had since been dismissed. The folder had contained this document, prepared in advance for a signing that was originally meant to happen under very different, very controlled circumstances, with full legal counsel present on both sides. Instead, it had ended up in the wrong hands, at the wrong hour, and had been signed by exactly the wrong person, in the exact right way to become permanently, completely legal. Elena said the word mistake 3 times, each one louder than the last, and Mr. Briggs did not argue with her once. He simply let her say it, the way a man lets a storm finish before he speaks again. He said the document had already been reviewed by 2 separate legal teams. He said the language was old but the mechanism was sound. He said, and this was the part Elena would remember most clearly, that under the law of the original estate charter, the marriage was not just legally binding, it was, in the eyes of that very old and very stubborn document, already real. Elena asked how many people even knew a clause like this still existed. She asked whether it had ever been tested in an actual court, whether any judge in the modern world would honor a marriage created by an accidental signature on a page meant for someone else entirely. Mr. Briggs said, with the careful patience of a man who had already anticipated every question she might ask, that the estate charter predated the country's current legal system and had been specifically protected under a grandfather clause when the modern courts were established, precisely because so many old titled families had fought to keep their private arrangements outside public jurisdiction. He said it had been tested twice in the last century, both times upheld, both times quietly, because families like the Voss family did not like their private business argued in open court any more than they liked losing control of their land. Elena said that was convenient for everyone except her. Mr. Briggs did not disagree. She asked to see the Duke. Mr. Briggs told her he had been present in the room the entire time. Elena turned, and for the first time noticed the man standing near the window at the far end of the study, half in shadow, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not read at all. He had not said a single word since she entered the room. He had let his lawyer do the explaining, the way a man lets someone else diffuse a situation he does not fully want diffused. He was younger than she expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of stillness that made a room feel smaller. He did not look surprised. He did not look sorry either. Elena said the only thing she could think to say, which was that she wanted the document voided immediately, that she had a life, a job, a mother who needed her, and that whatever this old law wanted from a stranger's signature, it could not have hers. The Duke finally spoke. His voice was quiet, low, the kind of voice that did not need volume because it had never needed to compete with anyone. He said that voiding the document was, unfortunately, not a simple matter, that the clause had specific and narrow requirements for dissolution, requirements that had not yet been reviewed in full, and that until they had been, the marriage stood. Elena said that was not an answer. He said it was the only one he had. Elena asked whether he had known about this clause before that folder ever landed on her desk. She asked whether some part of this had been arranged, whether her signature had been an accident at all, or something someone in his family had engineered while she sat alone in an office at midnight with no idea what page she was actually initialing. The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders shifted, a stiffness that had not been there a moment earlier. He said, evenly, that he had known the clause existed. He said he had not known her name, had never seen her face before this morning, and had certainly never arranged for a stranger's signature to end up on a document meant for someone else entirely. He said if she was looking for the architect of her misfortune, she would not find him standing at that window. Elena did not fully believe him. She also did not fully disbelieve him, and the uncertainty of that, standing in a study full of dead ancestors watching from their frames, unsettled her more than an outright lie would have. She asked what exactly he expected her to do now, whether he expected her to simply accept a life inside a house she had never asked to enter, married to a man whose family apparently rearranged people's lives with the same casual efficiency they used to trim their gardens. He said he expected nothing from her yet. He said the only thing he could offer, for now, was time, and the promise that his legal team would review every possible way to undo what a careless clerk and an unlucky knight had done to both of them. Elena said promises were easy to make standing on the correct side of an accident. She asked him, directly, whether he intended to try to fix this, or whether he intended to simply let an accident define the rest of her life. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her suddenly aware of her own posture, her own breathing, the pen still sitting on the desk between them that she could not stop staring at, wondering absurdly whether it was the same pen from that night, whether ink from that exact object had somehow rewritten the shape of her entire future. The Duke said 4 words. "You are mine now." He did not say it like a threat. He did not say it like a joke. He said it the way a man states the weather, a fact that did not require his permission to be true, and then he turned back toward the window, as though the conversation had already ended in his mind, even though Elena had at least 100 more things to say. Elena's mind raced through every practical objection she could think of, the way it always did when panic needed somewhere useful to go. She asked whether her job would be affected, whether Whitfield and Combs even knew what had happened to one of their own paralegals, whether there was some insurance policy, some clause within a clause, some ordinary modern safeguard that existed specifically to protect people from exactly this kind of accident. Mr. Briggs said patiently that the firm had been informed only that a filing error had occurred and that the matter was being handled privately between the 2 families involved, a phrase that made Elena's stomach twist because it meant her own employer had already agreed, in some quiet conversation she had not been part of, to let this happen to her without so much as a phone call of warning. She asked whether that meant her job was gone. Mr. Briggs said her position remained secure, that the firm valued its long relationship with the Voss estate a great deal, and that continuing her employment quietly, without complication, was very much in everyone's interest. Elena heard, underneath the polite phrasing, exactly what he meant. Her silence was worth something to these people. Her job was the leash Mr. Whitfield had agreed to hold on their behalf, whether he had meant it that way or not. Mr. Briggs closed the folder gently, as though closing it might somehow soften what had just happened. Elena stood in that study, staring at the back of a stranger who now, according to some document written before either of their grandparents were born, legally belonged to her as much as she apparently belonged to him, and she felt something twist in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger, something closer to the feeling of watching a door close from the wrong side of it. She thought about her mother, alone in that apartment with a nurse who left at 6. She thought about the electric bill she had barely paid. She thought about the black car outside her building for 4 straight days, patient as a held breath, and she understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that whatever this family wanted from her, they had clearly wanted it enough to wait. Mr. Briggs finally broke the silence, informing her, in the same even tone he used for everything, that arrangements had already been made for her to stay at the estate while the legal teams reviewed the matter properly, that a room had been prepared, that her mother's care would of course be covered by the estate for the duration, an offer delivered so casually it took Elena several seconds to understand it was meant as both a kindness and a leash. She wanted to refuse. She thought of the number at the bottom of those unopened bills, and found, to her own quiet horror, that she could not. The Duke did not turn back around when Mr. Briggs asked her, gently, whether she would like to see her room. As they walked, Mr. Briggs mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a driver had already been sent to collect a small bag of her belongings from her apartment, and that her mother's nurse had been informed only that Elena would be staying with a client for a short professional matter, nothing more. He said it gently, as though anticipating her objection before she could raise it, and Elena felt a fresh wave of helplessness settle over the whole situation, the sense that decisions about her own life were being made in rooms she was not invited into, by people who called it courtesy. She followed the lawyer out of the study, past the paintings of sharp-jawed strangers, and did not look back to see whether the Duke was still standing at that window, though some part of her, the part she did not like admitting existed, was certain that he was. The room they gave her was larger than her entire apartment. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, taking in the tall windows, the fireplace already lit, though no one had known she was coming until that morning, the bed with more pillows than she had ever owned in her life. A woman named Priya, who introduced herself as the estate's housekeeper, showed her where the bathroom was, where the wardrobe was, and asked, without a hint of judgment, whether she would like anything sent up before dinner. Elena said she was fine. She was not fine. She simply did not know what else there was to say to a woman who spoke about silk robes and evening meals as though this were an ordinary Tuesday. She spent the first hour alone in that room, doing the only thing that made sense to her, which was calling the nurse who cared for her mother and confirming, 3 separate times, that everything back home was exactly as it should be. The nurse sounded confused by the repetition but patient with it, the way people are patient with someone clearly under strain. Elena did not explain why she was calling from a number that was not her own phone. She did not know how to explain any of it yet, not even to herself. By early evening she had changed out of the clothes she arrived in, mostly because Priya had quietly taken them away to be washed and left something else hanging in the wardrobe instead, a soft gray dress that fit her almost exactly, which was its own small unsettling detail she chose not to examine too closely. Dinner was announced by a bell she did not expect, an actual bell, rung somewhere down the hall, and Elena followed the sound because it seemed easier than sitting alone with her thoughts a moment longer. The dining room was long enough that a person could have shouted from one end and barely been heard at the other, though only 2 places had been set, close together, at the far end near the fireplace. The Duke was already seated when she arrived, a glass of something dark in front of him that he had not touched, and a dog the size of a small horse lying across the floor beside his chair, lifting its head only briefly to inspect her before deciding she was not a threat worth standing up for. Elena sat, because standing seemed pointless, and because the dog's calm indifference to the entire situation was, oddly, the first thing that made her feel slightly less like she was losing her mind. The Duke did not speak first. He rarely seemed to. Elena, who had never in her life been comfortable with silence, filled it the way she always did, with the kind of dry observation that had gotten her through every uncomfortable meeting of her working life. She asked whether the dog had a name, or whether the family simply referred to it as the 4th resident of the house. The Duke's mouth moved, not quite a smile, close enough to count as one. He said the dog's name was Otto, and that Otto had strong opinions about everyone who entered the house, opinions the rest of the staff took very seriously. Elena said that Otto's opinion of her seemed to be complete disinterest, which she found refreshing given everyone else's reaction to her presence. The Duke said that was in fact Otto's highest possible compliment. It was the first almost normal exchange they had shared, and Elena found herself gripping it the way a person grips a handrail on unfamiliar stairs. Dinner arrived in courses she did not fully understand, food she could not name, and she ate carefully, watching the Duke for cues the way a person watches a foreign film without subtitles. He ate the way he spoke, without waste, without hurry, and for a long stretch neither of them said anything at all, the only sound the quiet clink of silverware and Otto's occasional sigh from the floor. Elena broke the silence again, because silence in that house felt like it belonged to someone else, and she refused to let it own her too. She asked him, plainly, how someone ends up with a law like the one sitting on Mr. Briggs's desk. She asked whether he had grown up knowing that clause existed, hanging over his life like a countdown no one had bothered explaining to him properly. The Duke set his fork down. He said the clause had always existed, buried in documents nobody read anymore, and that he had learned about it properly only a few years earlier, when a lawyer far less kind than Briggs had informed him of exactly how much time he had left before the estate would slip out of his hands entirely. Elena asked whether that had frightened him. He said, after a pause long enough to notice, that losing the estate had never frightened him nearly as much as everyone assumed it should. She did not understand that answer. Not fully, but something in the way he said it told her not to push further yet, so she let it sit, the way you let a held breath sit, before deciding whether to release it. She asked, instead, what he would have done with his life if the estate had never existed at all, if he had been born the second son of an ordinary family, with an ordinary house, and no ancient claws waiting to swallow his choices. The Duke considered the question longer than she expected, turning his glass slowly on the table without drinking from it. He said he had once wanted to study architecture, had spent a summer during university sketching bridges and libraries he had no intention of ever building professionally, simply because the drawing itself had felt like the only thing that was entirely his own. He said he had not touched a sketchbook in nearly 6 years. Elena asked why not. He said the estate did not leave much room for things that belonged only to him. Every hour, every decision, every conversation eventually found its way back to the land, the tenants, the trust, the title, until the parts of him that existed outside of all that had simply gone quiet from disuse, the way a muscle goes quiet when it is never asked to work. Elena said that sounded lonely. He said he had not had the word for it until she said it out loud just now. Dessert came, something with berries and cream that Elena barely tasted because her mind had wandered, unbidden, back to her mother, back to the way her mother's hands had started shaking last month, in a way that scared them both, though neither said so out loud. She mentioned it without meaning to, the way people mention things when they have simply run out of room to keep holding them alone. She said her mother was sick, had been sick for almost 2 years now, that the shaking was new, that the doctors kept using words like progression and management instead of words like cure, and that most of Elena's paycheck for the last year had gone toward keeping her comfortable rather than keeping herself afloat. She said it lightly, almost as a joke, the way she had trained herself to say hard things so they would not weigh as much in the room. The Duke went very still. It was not the stillness of boredom or indifference. Elena had already learned enough about him in a single evening to know the difference. This was the stillness of a man who had just heard something land somewhere he had not expected to be touched. He did not ask a single follow-up question. He did not offer sympathy in the practiced, hollow way people so often did. He simply looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes that she could not name, and then he looked down at Otto instead, one hand dropping to rest on the dog's head, as though he needed somewhere else to put it. Elena noticed his hand was not quite steady. She wanted to ask why. She did not. Dinner ended shortly after that, the Duke excusing himself with a formality that felt, for the first time all evening, like a wall going back up, rather than the natural end of a meal. Elena watched him leave the dining room, Otto trailing after him without being called, and sat alone at the long table for a moment longer than she needed to, turning the strange stillness of that moment over in her mind. On her second morning at the estate, Elena woke before the sun and wandered the halls alone, unable to sleep, drawn by a restlessness she did not fully understand. She found the estate's library by accident, a room even larger than the study, shelves rising 2 stories high, a ladder on rails still hooked to the top rung, as though someone had climbed it recently and never bothered to bring it back down. She ran her fingers along the spines of books she did not recognize, old surveys of the estate's land, ledgers of harvests going back further than she could easily calculate, and one shelf entirely devoted to family records, births and deaths recorded in careful, fading handwriting. She did not open that shelf. Some part of her understood, without needing to be told, that whatever waited there was not hers to read yet. Priya found her there an hour later and did not seem surprised, only offered tea and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the Duke came to this room most mornings before anyone else was awake, and had likely left only minutes before Elena arrived. Elena wondered, walking back to her room afterward, whether that was a coincidence, and decided, somewhere around the second flight of stairs, that she did not entirely believe in those anymore. She spent the next several days learning the shape of her new temporary life, because temporary was the word she used, out loud and to herself, every single time someone in that house referred to her as though she belonged there. She learned that the staff, without exception, treated her with a careful, watchful kindness, the kind reserved for someone whose position in the household they did not yet understand and were not about to guess wrong about. She learned that Priya brought her tea at exactly the same time every morning without being asked, and that a woman named Margot Vale, a distant cousin of the Duke's who visited the estate with unsettling frequency, watched Elena across every room they shared with an expression that was not quite hostile but was not far from it either. Margot was elegant in the practiced way of someone who had spent a lifetime being told she was, and she asked Elena questions that sounded polite and landed like small blades, questions about her family, her education, her plans, each one delivered with a smile that never once reached her eyes. Elena did not like her. She did not know yet whether that dislike was fair or simply instinct, but she trusted the instinct anyway, because it had kept her safe in rooms far less strange than this one. One afternoon, Elena found herself alone with Margot in the estate's sitting room, both of them waiting for the Duke to return from a meeting with his land steward. Margot poured tea for herself without offering any to Elena, a small discourtesy delivered with such practiced grace it barely registered as rude at all, and asked, conversationally, how long Elena expected this arrangement to last. Elena said she did not know. She said it honestly, because she genuinely did not. Margot smiled and said families like this one had a way of sorting themselves out eventually, that accidents rarely survived long against the weight of proper planning, and that she meant no offense by saying so, only that Elena should not grow too attached to a room, a dog, or a view she might not keep for very long. Elena said she appreciated the honesty, though she suspected honesty was not exactly what had just been offered to her. Margot's smile did not waver. She simply sipped her tea and changed the subject to the weather, and Elena spent the rest of that conversation feeling as though she had been quietly, politely warned about something she still could not name. The days settled into something almost like a rhythm. Mornings with tea and paperwork Elena still had no real authority over. Afternoons walking Otto through gardens that seemed to stretch further every time she explored them. Evenings at that long dinner table, where the Duke slowly, carefully, began saying more than 4 words at a time. He told her about the estate's history in fragments, never in full stories, the way a man shares things he has not fully made peace with yet. He mentioned, once, that he had an older brother, and then did not mention him again for 3 full days, though Elena noticed the way his jaw tightened every time a portrait of a young man with the same sharp features passed within view down the long hallway. She did not ask about the portrait. She filed the observation away instead, the way she used to file loose facts in her old job, certain it would matter eventually, certain that in a house built entirely out of things no one explained, every unexplained thing eventually explained itself. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered down to that hallway alone and stood in front of the portrait for a long time. The young man in the painting had the Duke's same sharp jaw, the same dark eyes, but his mouth was caught mid-smile, easy and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen on the Duke's face even once. Whoever he had been, he had clearly worn his life more lightly than his brother now wore his. Otto found her there, padding down the hallway on silent paws, and settled himself against her legs with a heavy, contented sigh, as though he too understood that some rooms in that house needed quiet company rather than questions. Elena stood there with her hand resting on the dog's head for a long while, looking up at a stranger she would never meet, before finally returning to bed. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Elena found Mr. Briggs waiting for her outside her room, holding a thin folder she recognized instantly by its cream-colored edges. He told her, quietly, that the legal team had finished its initial review of the dissolution clause, and that there was, in fact, a path available to void the marriage entirely. He told her it would not be simple, and it would not be private. But it existed. Elena took the folder from his hands, feeling the weight of it settle strangely against her palm, heavier than paper had any right to feel, and understood, standing in that quiet hallway with the portrait of a stranger's dead brother watching from somewhere down the hall, that whatever came next would not be decided by any old document. It would be decided by her. Elena read the folder 3 times before she allowed herself to believe what it said. The dissolution clause was real, buried deep in the same charter that had trapped her in the first place, written in language so old it barely resembled modern law. It required what the document called a public renouncement, a formal appearance before a small family tribunal made up of the estate's oldest surviving relatives, where both parties would state, in front of witnesses, that the union should be dissolved. It was rare, it was humiliating by design, meant to discourage exactly the kind of accidental marriages the original clause could create. And it was, according to Mr. Briggs, the only clean way out. Elena should have felt relief reading it. Instead, she felt something closer to dread, and she spent an entire night trying to understand why a way out could feel this much like a loss. She told herself it was simply exhaustion. She told herself that a dozen times before she stopped believing it. The next morning, she found Margot Vale waiting for her in the garden, seated on a stone bench beneath a tree that had clearly been there far longer than either of them, holding a cup of tea she had not touched. Margot asked, with the same practiced smile she always wore, whether Elena had heard the good news yet. She asked it the way a person asks a question they already know the answer to, testing only how the other person reacts. Elena said she had heard about the dissolution clause. Yes. Margot said it was a relief for everyone, especially for the family, who had been quite worried about what an outsider marrying into the estate might mean for certain arrangements already in motion. She said the word outsider the way some people say a curse word, lightly, but with clear intention behind it. Elena asked what arrangements Margot meant. Margot studied her for a moment, the way a person studies a competitor at a card table, deciding how much of her hand to show. She said, lightly, that every family this old carried arrangements that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with land, income, and the kind of continuity that outsiders rarely understood or appreciated. She said the estate's future had been discussed for years among the people who actually understood how to protect it, long before Elena's name had ever entered the conversation. Elena asked, directly, whether Margot herself was part of that discussion. Margot's smile flickered, just slightly, the first genuine crack Elena had seen in it since arriving at the estate. She said that was a very forward question for someone whose entire presence here was the result of a filing error, and then rose from the bench, smoothing her skirt with unnecessary care, as though the conversation had ended exactly where she wanted it to. Margot only smiled wider and said that some things were better discussed once the paperwork was properly finished, and then rose from the bench and walked back toward the house without waiting for Elena to respond, leaving her with the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that she had just been warned about something she did not yet understand. Elena spent the rest of that day turning Margot's words over in her mind, the way she used to turn over strange clauses in contracts back at her old job, hunting for the sentence that did not fit, the one detail that would unravel everything else if she pulled on it hard enough. She found Priya in the kitchen garden that afternoon, gathering herbs for the evening meal, and asked her, carefully, what she knew about Margot's place in the family. Priya hesitated, the kind of hesitation that came from years of practice keeping estate business exactly where it belonged, then said only that Margot's branch of the family had once been much closer to inheriting the title themselves, 2 generations back, before a shift in the succession rules had moved the line elsewhere. She said Margot's own mother had never fully accepted that shift and had raised her daughter, by all accounts, to view the estate as something temporarily misplaced rather than permanently lost. Elena asked whether that resentment ever showed itself in anything more than cold tea and pointed questions. Priya only said that the staff had learned, a long time ago, not to repeat what they noticed, and went back to her herbs with the quiet finality of someone who had already said more than she meant to. She found the Duke that evening in his study, standing at the same window he had been standing at the night she first arrived, Otto asleep at his feet. She told him, without preamble, about her conversation with Margot. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, and saw something flicker there, brief but unmistakable, the look of a man hearing a suspicion confirmed rather than a new one raised. He did not deny that something was happening beneath the surface of all this. Instead, he asked her to sit, and for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, he told her something without being pushed into it. He said that before the accident with the folder, before any of this had happened, there had been another plan already in motion for his marriage, an arrangement discussed quietly between his family and Margot's branch of it, one that would have kept the estate's full control within a very narrow circle of relatives, Margot included. He said the accidental marriage to a complete stranger, someone entirely outside that circle, had thrown the entire arrangement into chaos that certain people were now working very quickly to correct. Elena asked whether that meant Margot had something to do with the folder ending up on her desk in the first place. The Duke said he did not know for certain, not yet, but that Mr. Briggs was already looking into the junior clerk who had been dismissed the night everything went wrong, and that the timing of that clerk's sudden disappearance from the estate's employment records was, at the very least, worth questioning. Elena felt something cold settle low in her stomach. The idea that her entire life had been rearranged not by accident but by someone else's careful hand was worse, somehow, than the accident itself. She asked the Duke directly whether he wanted her to sign the dissolution papers. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Otto lifted his head from the floor as though sensing the shift in the room. Then the Duke said something Elena had not expected. He said he had already signed his half of the dissolution papers 3 days earlier, before she had even been given the folder, that Mr. Briggs was simply waiting on her signature to finish the process entirely. Elena felt something drop through her chest, sharp and sudden, and she was furious at herself for how much it hurt to hear that he had already made the choice without her. She asked why he had signed it so quickly, if he was so certain about it. He said, quietly, that it was not certainty, it was fairness. He said he had no right to keep someone bound to a life they never chose, no matter what strange accident had made the law say otherwise, and that keeping her here, against her will, even gently, even kindly, was not something he could live with. Elena said that was a very convenient thing to say for a man who had told her, in that same study, only weeks earlier, that she was his now, as though that fact settled something. The Duke's jaw tightened. He said that on the night he had said those words, he had meant something different than she assumed. He said he had spent years being told the estate needed him to marry, needed him to produce an heir, needed him to be useful in exactly the way his family required, and that in a strange, twisted way, the accidental marriage had been the first time in his adult life that someone existed under his roof who did not want anything from his title at all. He said that had felt, for reasons he was still working out, like relief rather than obligation. He said he had not meant to claim her that night. He had meant, without knowing how to say it properly, that for the first time in a very long while, something had simply been decided for him instead of something he had to decide alone. Elena did not know what to do with that. She had walked into this study angry, certain she understood exactly what kind of man he was, and now found herself standing in the wreckage of a version of him she had not expected to exist. She asked, more gently this time, about the portrait in the hallway. The young man with his same sharp jaw. The Duke was quiet again, longer this time. He said the portrait was of his older brother, Julian, who had been meant to inherit the estate entirely, who had understood the title and its demands the way Elena understood old legal documents, easily, naturally, without resentment. He said Julian had died 4 years earlier, suddenly, in a way the family rarely spoke about even among themselves, and that the entire weight of the estate, the clause, the marriage requirement, all of it, had landed on Alessandro's shoulders only because there had been no one else left standing to carry it. Elena said she was sorry. He said most people said that, Almost none of them meant it the way she seemed to. He told her, quietly, that Julian had died in a boating accident on the estate's own lake, on a calm afternoon, with no warning and no explanation anyone had ever been able to give the family that made the loss feel any less senseless. He said he had been away at university when it happened, had come home to a house already rearranged around a grief no one wanted to name properly, and had spent the years since being measured constantly against a brother who had wanted the title, the land, and the responsibility in a way Alessandro had never quite managed to want any of it himself. He said he had spent so long being told what his life was supposed to replace that he had nearly forgotten to ask what he actually wanted it to become. Elena did not offer him a tidy response. She simply sat with him in the quiet, letting the fire fill the silence, instead of forcing words into it, and something about that, the simple absence of pressure to perform comfort, seemed to settle something in him that speeches never could have. They stood there together for a long moment, the fire crackling low in the hearth, Otto's steady breathing the only other sound in the room, and Elena felt something shift quietly between them, something that had nothing to do with old documents or ancient clauses, something that felt, for the first time, entirely hers to decide. She left the study that night without signing anything. She told herself it was because she needed more time to think. She was not entirely sure that was true. The following morning, word arrived that the family tribunal had been scheduled, sooner than expected, pushed forward at Margot's request through channels Elena did not fully understand. Mr. Briggs explained, with visible frustration, that Margot's branch of the family had legal standing to request an expedited hearing, and that the tribunal would now take place in 3 days rather than 3 weeks. Elena understood, without needing it explained further, exactly what that meant. Someone wanted this decided quickly, before either she or the Duke had time to change their minds. That night, Elena sat by her window watching the estate's gardens fade into darkness, the folder of dissolution papers still unsigned on the desk behind her, and thought about how strange it was that a document meant to set her free now felt heavier in her hands than the one that had trapped her in the first place. She thought about her mother's shaking hands, about the receipts she had stopped opening, about a black car that had waited outside her building with the patience of something that already knew how this would end. She thought about 4 words spoken quietly by a window, and wondered, for the first time since arriving at that house, what she actually wanted the answer to be, rather than what circumstance had decided for her. She did not sleep easily that night either, but for the first time in weeks, it was not fear keeping her awake. The 3 days before the tribunal passed the way the last hours before a storm pass, quiet on the surface, heavy underneath. Elena spent the first day going over the dissolution folder again and again, reading the same paragraphs until the words lost their meaning, searching for anything Margot's push for an early hearing might be hiding. Mr. Briggs joined her on the second day, bringing with him records he had finally managed to pull on the dismissed clerk, a young man named Callum Hart, who had worked at Whitfield and Combs for less than 4 months before the night the folders were switched. According to the records, Callum had received a payment shortly after his sudden departure, a payment that traced back, through 2 shell accounts, to a branch of the family Margot Vale herself controlled. Mr. Briggs explained, carefully, that this did not prove Margot had orchestrated the switch intentionally to trap Elena specifically. It was more likely, he said, that Margot had simply wanted the folder delayed, or lost entirely, to buy time for her own marriage arrangement with the Duke to be finalized first. The accident of Elena signing it had never been the plan. It had simply been the unintended result of someone else's plan going wrong in exactly the wrong way. Elena asked what that meant for the tribunal. Mr. Briggs said it meant Margot now had every reason to want this marriage dissolved as quickly and quietly as possible, before anyone started asking questions about where Callum Hart's payment had actually come from. He added, more carefully than before, that he had also tracked down a forwarding address for Callum himself, a small flat 2 towns over, and that a brief conversation with the young man, conducted politely and without any threat of legal action, had confirmed what the records already suggested. Callum had been paid to misplace a specific folder for a single evening, nothing more, with no instruction about who might end up signing it, or what the consequences might become. He had taken the money because he needed it, panicked when the mistake spiraled far beyond anything he intended, and resigned before anyone could ask him the questions he did not want to answer. Elena found, oddly, that she felt no anger toward Callum at all. He had been a small, frightened piece moved by someone else's hand, the same as she had been, only positioned slightly closer to the person actually pulling the strings. Mr. Briggs said he did not yet have proof solid enough to bring before the tribunal directly, only the shape of a pattern, and that pursuing it further risked tipping Margot off before the hearing that they knew anything at all. He recommended patience. He recommended letting the tribunal play out first, and dealing with the rest of it once the marriage's status was no longer in question. Elena agreed, though patience was not a quality that came easily to her at the best of times, and these were not the best of times. Elena spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of a room that no longer felt entirely unfamiliar, turning over everything Mr. Briggs had told her and everything the Duke had said in his study 2 nights earlier. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found Priya waiting outside her door with a garment bag and an expression Elena could not quite place. Priya said the family had asked that she wear something appropriate for the tribunal, and helped her into a deep green dress that fit the way everything in that house seemed to fit her now, as though it had been made with her in mind rather than simply handed to her. The tribunal was held in a room Elena had not seen before, at the far end of the estate's oldest wing, a long chamber with a raised platform at one end, where 3 elderly relatives sat behind a heavy wooden table, flanked by Mr. Briggs on one side and a lawyer Elena did not recognize on the other, presumably representing Margot's branch of the family. Margot herself sat near the front, dressed in pale gold, watching Elena's entrance with an expression of polite, careful patience that did not reach her eyes. The Duke stood near the far wall, apart from everyone else, dressed formally in a way that made him look older and more tired than she had seen him look in the 2 weeks she had known him. He did not look at Margot. He looked, briefly, at Elena, and then away, as though looking too long might change something he had already decided to accept. The proceedings began with the eldest of the 3 relatives reading, in a dry, formal voice, the exact language of the original clause, the same phrases Elena had first seen on that strange final page 6 weeks earlier. Binding union, ancestral right, mutual signature. He explained, for the benefit of the tribunal's official record, that the dissolution required both parties to appear, both parties to state clearly that the union should be voided, and both parties to sign the renouncement in the presence of the assembled family. Mr. Briggs stepped forward first, confirming for the record that the Duke's half of the renouncement had already been signed 3 days prior, and that only Elena's signature remained outstanding. Elena felt every eye in the room settle on her at once. Somewhere behind her, she heard the quiet scrape of a chair, one of the relatives shifting for a better view, and the small, dry cough of a very old man clearing his throat before speaking again. The room smelled faintly of old wood polish, and something underneath it, wax candles perhaps, burned so often in that chamber, over so many generations, that the scent had settled permanently into the stone itself. A single shaft of afternoon light came through the tall window behind the raised platform, cutting across the floor in a way that made the dust in the air visible, drifting slowly, unbothered by the tension gathering beneath it. Elena thought, absurdly, that a room this old had probably watched dozens of marriages begin and end exactly like this, generation after generation, family members standing where she now stood, deciding in front of strangers whether a life belonged to them or not. The thought did not comfort her. It only made the moment feel heavier, as though she were adding her own name to a ledger far longer than the one she had glimpsed in the estate's library days earlier. She stepped forward when asked, taking the folder Mr. Briggs offered, the papers inside identical to the ones she had reviewed a dozen times already. The renouncement was short, only a few lines, requiring nothing more than her name and the date to end this entirely, to send her back to her old apartment, her old job, her old life, with the medical bills and the electric bill and the quiet, ordinary shape of a future that had made sense before any of this began. She thought of her mother. She thought of the black car parked outside her building for 4 days straight, patient as a held breath. She thought of Otto's head resting against the Duke's hand at that first dinner, and the stillness in his face when she mentioned her mother's illness without meaning to. She thought of a portrait in a hallway, a brother she never met, and a man who had spent years being told exactly what his life was supposed to be for. She thought of 4 words, said quietly, without any of the arrogance she had assumed they carried at the time. Margot shifted in her seat, the first genuine crack in her composure Elena had seen since arriving at the estate, a flicker of impatience that told Elena, more clearly than any document ever could, exactly how much this outcome mattered to her. Elena looked down at the pin Mr. Briggs had placed beside the folder, an ordinary pin, black, unremarkable, and found herself thinking, absurdly, of the pin from that first night at the office, wondering whether ink from an identical object had somehow started all of this, and whether a different pin now had the power to end it. She picked it up. She held it over the signature line long enough that the room went completely silent, long enough that even the eldest relative at the raised table leaned forward slightly, waiting. Then she set the pen down, capped, untouched, beside the unsigned papers. She said, clearly enough for the entire chamber to hear, that she was not renouncing the marriage. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in that house. It was not the silence of shock exactly, though there was shock in it. It was the silence of a room recalculating everything it had assumed was already decided. Margot stood so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the stone floor and began to object, something about improper procedure, about the marriage having been an accident from the start, about Elena having no real claim to a life she had never asked for. The eldest relative raised one hand, and Margot's objection died in her throat. He asked Elena, formally, to confirm her decision for the tribunal's record. Elena said she understood the marriage had begun as a mistake. She said she understood she had never asked for any of this, had never wanted a title or an estate or a life measured in stone hallways and inherited jawlines. She said all of that plainly, without apology, because it was true, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise in front of people who clearly already believed the worst version of why she might stay. Then she said that somewhere between a folder switched by mistake and a tribunal room full of relatives waiting for her to disappear quietly, she had stopped wanting to leave, not because of any old document, but because of a man who had signed away his own claim to her 3 days before she ever had the chance to sign away hers, simply because he thought it was the fair thing to do. She said that was not the behavior of someone trying to trap her. That was the behavior of someone who had spent his entire life being told what he had to keep, finally learning what it felt like to let something go, and doing it anyway, even though it clearly cost him something to do. She looked, for the first time since entering the chamber, directly at the Duke. He was watching her the way a man watches something he has stopped expecting to survive intact. The eldest relative declared, for the tribunal's record, that in the absence of a completed renouncement from both parties, the original union remained legally and fully in effect, and that the estate's earlier arrangement with Margot's branch of the family was, as a result, formally and permanently dissolved. Margot left the chamber without another word, her pale gold dress disappearing through the heavy wooden doors, so quickly it was almost as though she had never been in the room at all. Mr. Briggs quietly gathered the unsigned papers, and Elena noticed, as he did, a small flicker of something that might have been relief on his own, carefully composed face, the expression of a man who had spent weeks worried about an outcome he was not allowed to have an opinion on, finally allowed to exhale. The Duke crossed the room slowly, the way a man crosses a distance he has been afraid to cross for a long time, and stopped in front of her without immediately speaking, as though he was still recalculating the moment himself. He said, quietly, that he had not expected this. Elena said that made 2 of them. He said, and there was something almost like humor threaded through the words this time, that he supposed this meant she really was his now, and that perhaps, finally, that was allowed to mean something kinder than the way he had first said it. Elena said that if he ever said those 4 words to her again like a legal conclusion, instead of a person actually meaning them, she would personally arrange for Otto to sleep in his bed for the rest of the dog's natural life. The Duke's mouth moved into something that was, unmistakably, a full smile, the first she had seen from him since the night she arrived. Mr. Briggs approached her quietly before the chamber emptied entirely, mentioning, in the same even tone he used for everything, that the matter of Callum Hart's payment would now be pursued properly, with Margot's branch of the family formally removed from any further claim on the estate's trust, regardless of how that particular investigation concluded. He said the tribunal's ruling had effectively closed the door Margot had spent months trying to keep open, and that whatever came next for her would happen far away from this house. Elena felt something loosen in her chest hearing that, a tension she had been carrying so long she had almost stopped noticing its weight. Later that evening, back in her room, Elena found an envelope waiting on the small writing desk by the window, plain, unsealed, with her name written on the front in handwriting she did not recognize. Inside was a single piece of paper, a receipt from her mother's medical provider, marked paid in full, the balance that had haunted every unopened envelope in her old apartment reduced, finally, to a clean and simple 0. There was no note attached explaining it. There did not need to be. She sat with the receipt for a long time, the fire crackling quietly in the hearth, Otto's occasional footsteps audible somewhere down the hall, and on the writing desk beside the receipt sat the same ordinary black pen from the tribunal chamber, capped, unused, carried back to her room by someone who had clearly thought she might want to keep it. She did not sign anything else that night. She simply sat there, in a house that had started as a mistake and was slowly, carefully, becoming something else entirely, and let the quiet settle around her the way quiet settles around a person who has finally stopped waiting for the next disaster to knock on the door. There was a knock at her door not long after, soft, almost hesitant, entirely unlike the confident stillness she had come to associate with the man on the other side of it. She opened it to find the Duke standing there without Otto for once, holding nothing, asking for nothing, simply asking whether she might want company for a while, if she was not too tired. Elena said she was not too tired at all. They sat together by the fire for a long while after that, saying very little, the kind of silence that no longer needed filling, and somewhere in that quiet Elena understood that whatever this had started as, an accident, a mistake, a stranger's careless signature on the wrong page at the wrong hour, it had become something neither old law nor old grudges could take back from her now. Outside, for the first time in 6 weeks, there was no black car waiting in the dark. There did not need to be one anymore.